belleza. Le llaman la muñequita fea. Le dicen la muñequita fea.
Amigos de Seattle Radio. Amigos de Seattle Radio.
Muy buenos días, amigos de Facebook Live, amigos de Seattle. Está aquí de nuevo en la radio con DRCC, la voz de la justicia. El día de hoy tenemos unos invitados aquí con nosotros. Good morning, everyone. This is Maggie from DRCC. We are back at the studio of Amigos de Seattle Radio with some of our DRCC friends. El día de hoy vamos a hablar en inglés, entonces para los que nos están viendo en Facebook, saluditos desde el estudio de Amigos de Seattle. For those of you that are watching on Facebook through our cell phone screen right now and are going to be listening through the conversation, good morning. Thank you for being here. We will record this meeting and we will post it on our DRCC website as well as Amigos de Seattle website and Facebook. So thank you so much. Again, this will be an English session. So we will potentially talk about the same topics in Spanish later on. So good morning, James. Good morning, Ellie, and good morning, Bill. How are you this morning?
Morning.
Really good.
Really excited that you're here today. I know it took us a while to get us together here, but we made it. It took a village, as Bill said, but we made it and we're here together in the space virtually. So good morning. Thank you for being here. A little bit about Amigos de Seattle. I know I didn't talk to y'all about it. DRCC hosts a weekly session on Amigos de Seattle, which is a nonprofit. They have had a grant for a year now. They just turned a year 2 nights ago. So it was their anniversary. And their main focus is reaching out to the South Park community. So as many cultures as they can, as many languages as they can. Through their programs, you'll hear them talking about different cultures. So Guatemala, different languages, different foods, different resources, including environmental justice and just social issues going on in the community. It is called La Voz de South Park, so meaning the voice of South Park. That's one of their sayings here at the radio. So welcome to the radio. Happy to have you here. I will go ahead and let you each introduce yourself. So if you could just say your name, if you wish, your pronouns, and where you work.
So good morning, everybody. My name is James Rasmussen. I am the Superfund manager for the Dewamish River Community Coalition. Almost said it wrong. And I'm really happy to have with us probably the main person we deal with at EPA, Elly Hale, is our guest today, and Bill Dunbar. I'll have Bill introduce himself because I don't know you all that well. But Elly Hale is the site manager for the Lower Duwamish Waterway Superfund site. And she's been that now for, what did we figure out? Was it 10 years now?
Not quite, James.
Okay. But before she moved here, or before she moved to the Dewamish River, I believe you were the site manager for Eagle Harbor, the cleanup that happened there as well. And she's also been a very important part of one of our good allies and friends who used to work for us. And actually, when he first started staying in Seattle, stayed with you, Ellie. So,
Earth Core, I love Earth Core.
yeah, yeah. And so I'm really happy to have Elly here to go through some basic questions about where we are in the Superfund site, some of the history and that type of stuff. And Bill, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, James, and thanks, Maggie, for doing this, for having us. This is a great thing. We're super happy to do this. This is exactly the kind of communication we should be having, and we think it's going to be really helpful for us, and hopefully people in the community will get a lot out of this from Elly, mostly because Ellie's the expert. She's the guru on all of this stuff. And my role is funny. I sort of serve as an unofficial translator for all of our super smart scientists. Elly being one of the smartest. She's sort of a hero at EPA for the amazing work she does, and her sensitivity and her thoughtfulness and thoroughness. So she's a scientist, and I'm not a scientist, but I help make sense of what we're doing. We're sort of elected officials and the media sometimes, and I help sort of figure out how to talk about it, in a way that makes sense. And so that's about it. I must say though, we have a lot of scientists, lots of engineers, biologists, chemists, physicists. So translating these smart people is a lot of work, but it's fun and I enjoy it. And so I'm super happy to be here, and I'll probably just be nodding my head a lot today.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. Elly, is there anything else you wanted to say?
Well, I'll just give you the start date. I started in the beginning of 2015 on the Lower Duwamish Waterway. And also to say thank you all for having me, because I do agree this is a great way to get our information out to the community. And Bill, thank you for the praise, but back at you.
So anyway, again, I want to say how much we enjoy the relationship we have with EPA, especially with Elly Hale, because she explains things to us, making sure that we're brought along, and listens to us as well. And all of those things are important to us. So are you ready to start, Elly?
I think so. Far away, I might divert you for some background, but go ahead and ask me your first question.
Okay, well, what we have here is to just briefly describe the early actions that we've already taken on the river, and then kind of why they're important.
Sure. Well, first a little bit about why sediment cleanup is important, if that's okay. Yeah. So our work is focused on cleaning up sediment, which is the stuff at the bottom of the water. It's the mud at the bottom. Sometimes it's sand or mud or rocks. And it gets contaminated over time if there are contaminated particles that drop to the bottom. And that mud is where there are animals living, and they live in the mud and they live on the mud. And if they are eating the little microbes that are living in the mud, and then a little shrimpy thing eats the little fishy thing, all of these sort of food relationships, if there's contamination in the mud, it gets into the food. And so our focus has been, and will always be, on cleaning up the sediment, the mud, so that we can get the food chain less contaminated. And that's important for everybody, and especially it's important for people who eat fish and shellfish. And I'll be talking later about, like why we want to make sure that the message is clear what not to eat. But that's why we focus on sediment cleanup, because the pollution is stuck on these particles. They went to the bottom, and it's really a pretty shallow layer at the bottom, right? You go through the water, and then there's the mud. You don't have to go very far down before it starts being not very busy with life. But for that top 10 centimeters, which is about 4 inches, it's a very busy little environment with living things. And so we want to have a safe environment for them and for all the food web that relies on them.
Thank you very much. So now
about early actions. Okay. Well, when we have a Superfund site, it can be a big project. And as you know, the Lower Duwamish Waterway is 5 miles long. So that's a lot of land. And it's been pretty contaminated for a pretty long time. And so when the EPA is looking at actions to take at Superfund sites, we have a very systematic process of a site study to understand where is the contamination, who is at risk, are the ecological critters at risk, are people at risk, and if there's unacceptable risk, what must we do? Oh, thank you. He's showing the front of the Remedial Investigation. So the Remedial Investigation takes some time, and And it started in 2001. And so right away, people knew that there were some areas that were more contaminated than other areas. And that if we could maybe reduce the overall contamination by doing early actions, because the systematic process takes a lot of time. Because after the remedial investigation, there's an evaluation of how to do cleanup. And then there's a public process to get comments on a proposed cleanup plan. And finally, you get a cleanup plan. And then there's more sampling and design and engineering, and then construction. That's the record of decision. Thank you. How convenient. They're like the Holy Bible. So the early actions are our way to reduce the risks to the environment and to humans by reducing the amount of sediment contamination. And so during the, I said RIFS, and I'm not supposed to use those acronyms, but during the big site study, the parties doing the study working with EPA all agreed that some work should be done early, and they call them early action area cleanups. So there's a map, and if you look online, you would probably find it, but I'll describe how the river goes south to north. It's a big stretch of river with Harbor Island outside of our site boundary, and Tukwila kind of on the south end. So the early actions started with two cleanups, one on the south end called the Norfolk cleanup, and one north of that on the north end called the Dewamish diagonal. And these were cleanups that weren't EPA requirements under the Superfund program, but they were part of a way to clean up the dirty sediments near these big outfalls where when water treatment systems are overwhelmed, combined sewer and storm water comes out. So those two cleanups happened soonest. I think 1999 was the first one, and 2003 or 4 was the second one. And they dredged, and dredging is to pick up sediments, right? They took out the contaminated sediments and they backfilled or capped in some cases. If there was still contamination, they would put a cap over it. So those two cleanups happened early on, and then it took a while for us to get through all the other actions, but we are now at the end of a cleanup at Boeing Plant 2, which is a big one, and Terminal 117, which included some upland areas, but in terms of the sediment, it also cleaned up some contaminated sediments right on the shore. And now it's so exciting, it's going to be a new habitat area and a park with public access to the water. It's the best. We can't take credit for that. We can take credit for getting the cleanup done. And then slip 4 is one of the slips are those little sort of side channels that used to be part of the winding river. And they're all that didn't get filled after when the river became a waterway through dredging up and filling in the curves. So there's a slip that was dredged and capped. So all in all, an estimated 29 acres has been cleaned up through these early actions. One area is still in progress, the Earl M. Jorgensen site, and that's it's just a small amount of sediment next to a pretty large upland area, and the upland area also needs cleanup under ecology state programs. But the sediment part is a lot better than it was, but it's not done yet. So we're still working on getting the last pieces of that in place. Did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And you already answered this. Most of these cleanups, and I just want to make sure, were done by dredging. And then, as you say, maybe capping on top of it. But most of them were done by dredging, and maybe you can kind of explain that a little bit more.
Well, I think, so one thing about early actions is you don't know exactly what the final cleanup plan will be, but you can kind of get a sense of that. You know, everybody's looking at the data and trying to make decisions. And So when you have an early action, you get an action level that goes with the early action. And so I guess I would say that depending on the early action itself, there were slightly different reasons for doing the action and slightly different methods for doing the action. So at Boeing Plant 2, I'm pretty sure, and this all happened before I was a project manager, I'm pretty sure they went very deep with dredging, and then they used clean material to backfill it, and backfilling it means just to fill the hole up to where it was before. And as you know, they've created also some beautiful habitat with that clean backfill material. I think it was in slip 4, they didn't get every bit of contamination out. They dug down deep enough, and then they placed a cap on top of that. And a cap is a little more structured and engineered compared to just a backfill. As in general, you know, they have to sort of calculate how much thickness they need and what will happen if there's contamination over time. Will that contamination slowly diffuse into the clean material? So there's ways to evaluate that. And if you see that that's a problem, you can add carbon, activated carbon. And so in the slip 4 cap, there is activated carbon as part of the cap.
Excellent. And so related now, what we've already done with the early actions, and as you say, a lot of them are done a little bit differently. So are these kind of methods the same kind of methods that we will be using for the cleanup of the whole river?
Yeah, the technologies that we have to choose from are pretty limited. If you, and it makes sense. This stuff is underwater. And so to get it out of the, you can either excavate it, which you do with dredging. And that's kind of like taking a biter, dropping it onto the bottom, having it take a bite of sediment, and you lift it up through the water and put it on a barge. And the barge carries it to land and it goes to a landfill. That's, so dredging is one of the tools. Capping is another tool. When you put a layer of clean material on top and an engineered, you make sure that it's going to be secure, it's not going to be washed away, it's not going to be contaminated. So combination of dredging, capping, sometimes there's not room, the water isn't deep enough to put a cap in, and the cap can be 3 or 4 feet thick, right? So if you're going to suddenly make land, well, that's not okay. So in some cases we dredge down so that the cap has room, and then there's still water over the top and boats can come and go, right? And so the cleanup plan has to include, dredging, capping alone, sometimes dredging and capping, because if you can't get it all with dredging, you can cover it up with a cap. And then there's one other, there's really 2 other things. We are in part of this natural system. The Green River becomes the Dewamish River, and it flows into the waterway. And it carries, it's a very large watershed, it carries particles all the way downstream. And so there's always new material coming into the waterway. And so as that deposits on the bottom, it makes the bottom come up a little bit, which can be a problem. But mostly what it does is it covers and mixes in with the sediment that's already there. And so over time, that zone, that layer where the animals live, gets cleaner. It's called natural recovery. So we can wait and watch and measure and make sure that that's happening. Or we can use enhanced natural recovery, which is kind of making a little layer of clean sediment instead of a big, thick one. And the reason we would do that is that it's actually less impact to that environment. Then it doesn't make a big, thick layer, right?
Absolutely. Now, with the early actions that we've already taken, how much of the pollution do you think has been taken out?
Well, when we were doing the big study before the cleanup plan, we did an estimate, and the estimate, is an estimate, but we thought that based on what we knew about each area, if you took out the contaminated sediments in those early action areas, the average concentration across the waterway would probably be 50% lower for PCBs in particular. Now, I haven't described PCBs, but they are really, they're the most important and most prevalent. They're most everywhere contaminant. And so, they have, we predicted that they would probably drop around 50% because of these early action area cleanups. So after the cleanup plan, we did a site-wide sampling, and that site-wide sampling shows that that 50% reduction has happened. And we will continue to sample as time goes by and make sure that that is continuing to be true.
Now, the important question now, you've said we've taken out half of the PCBs. Does that mean that we have half a reduction in health risk to fishers?
So let's just say the average level in surface sediments has gone down by half, which isn't the same as half of the PCBs, right? Because it's a very large area that has different levels of PCBs. And even though we took out some areas with higher levels of PCBs during the early actions, really what we have to do is continue our work to clean up the rest of the site. We do test, so the real measurement of how we reduced risk, right, is what's in the things that people might eat. What is in the seafood? And have we seen the seafood contamination levels drop down? And it's hard, you know, it's in that same sampling when we got all of the sediment samples site-wide for the whole site, right? We also took samples of fish and crabs and clams. And the results are difficult to compare because we didn't do the same sampling in the RIFS, but we do now have a pretty good baseline. What we don't see is a major reduction compared to what we saw during the big study. So that's not a surprise. It can take time for that food web and for the fish to kind of age out. And then you get cleaner food and younger fish that have been eating cleaner food, right? And so their bodies don't have as much, but it takes time. And so we actually have some sampling coming. We'll repeat that sampling in 2023, and everybody wants to know, will we see some changes? But I will say, even if we see changes, we are not ready, and we won't be ready for a long time, to say that people should eat fish from the Dewamish. No, no, no. Don't eat the resident fish. Salmon are the safer choice, but fish that live their whole lives in the Dewamish are still contaminated and should not be eaten. So that message is not going to change for the foreseeable future. We have a lot of cleanup left to do. And just in case people aren't aware, we are doing the design for the first phase of cleanup and also for the second phase. And there are 3 phases. So right now we're designing the upper reach, which is the one on the south end, closest to Tukwila. And we're just starting the design on the middle reach. So we'll be kind of working in the areas near South Park and Georgetown before we get to that last bit near Harbor Island. So again, these things take time. We probably won't have a completed design for the first phase until the end of next year.
I know that I tried to describe this to people as, you know, it's not like one layer of contamination throughout the river at all. They're like different splotches, kind of like on my kitchen floor. You know, I've got splotches here and there, and you work on cleaning those big splotches up, but that still means that there are other splotches that you need to work on. And I think that's where we are, because that's just as you said, the little critters in the mud that the fish eat are still feeding in those areas that are still dirty. And so that's why we worked on the big stains on the kitchen floor first. Now we go back and find the rest of those stains and try to make sure that we get the best clean kitchen floor as we can.
Hey,
That
can I
reminds
jump?
me. Yeah.
Can I jump in here? And I just want to say, because I love I love that example, James. It's perfect. Because this is the difficulty of cleaning up an active river versus, say, even a lake, where you continue to have water running through this thing, and so you clean up one spot. Let's say your kitchen floor, you get done cleaning it, and then somebody just walks in through with muddy shoes, and which is sort of what's still happening, right? In the river, we clean it up, but the stuff coming in from upstream of the Superfund side in the Green River is not clean, right? It's laden with PCBs and pollutants and of all sorts. So that stuff isn't perfectly clean water either. So you're sort of constant, or sediment, and it's sort of a constant, it's like going to the beach and pulling up some sand, and the water just going to fill right back in. It's so it's an ongoing effort, and yeah, so it's gonna take a bit.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, Boeing did their early action area, and they had clean sediment when they were finished constructing it. And they've been measuring the top 10 centimeters, and the top 10 centimeters still look good. So, it's mixing, and there are things living in that clean sediment. But if you just take the newest sediment layer that landed on top, that looks more contaminated. And it does that, so there's stuff that's sort of swirling around a little bit, and sediment comes and it goes. A big storm comes, more sediment comes in, and then another storm comes and washes that away. So it's not like completely, moving around, but we do find that some fine sediments land on top, and those finer sediments tend to have more contamination. So we're keeping an eye on that, and we will be looking at the whole waterway to make sure that we continue to make progress.
Well, it's not just looking at the whole waterway. You, EPA, and the Department of Ecology is doing the
Pollutant
loading assessment. Yes, instead of saying PLA, it's pollutant loading assessment, and that is actually looking at how do we reduce contamination in the whole watershed, and so which is an important part of cleaning up the river. We need to clean up part of the watershed as well, which is all ongoing. Now, when we look at all of this stuff, and I heard what you said as far as the reduction, in contamination, and what you're looking at is the fish and the seafood in the river itself. And again, to reiterate, salmon is the safer choice, and that's important for people to remember, because the critters that live in the river all year around, they are polluted. And so we all have to remember that. But when we talk about kind of where we are right now, as you said, we're working on the upper and the middle. Kind of give us an idea of how we get to where we want to be, and then what is that goal, and maybe some ideas of if we can't really get there, then there's all kinds of things that can be done.
Yeah, and because you're intimate with our record of decision, which is the final cleanup plan, right? That we have two important numbers, and one kind of group of numbers is called action levels, and they're the numbers. They tend to be a slightly higher number than the other set of numbers. The action levels say, if you have contamination levels above these action levels, well, then you have to take action. So they help us figure out what are the boundaries of the dirty spots on your kitchen floor, right? Where do we have to take active cleanup? Because in some parts of the waterway, it's actually pretty clean, right? And some parts are dirty. So it helps us define the edges of areas where we will do active cleanup. And by that, I mean dredging or capping or a combination or enhanced natural recovery. Those are all active cleanup technologies. Or if in those cleaner areas, we'll just monitor and let the time pass and see what happens as the cleaner sediments pile on top, right? So action levels are important in the decision because they tell us where we need to take action. But we expect that after we do all the active cleanup, the levels will go down and risk will go down, but 10 more years or so later, we'll see where we are, because 10 years of cleaner sediment coming downstream might mean that the average concentration in the waterway is as good as it's going to get, right? We took the little brown spots from your floor, right? We took those out, and then more clean sediment came in from upstream, and hopefully it will be cleaner. And on the waterway average, it will continue to just keep getting cleaner until it can't get any cleaner, because what's coming in is what it is, right? It just is what it is. And there are limits. You know, I don't know if people know that PCBs are everywhere. PCBs are everywhere. And I wish it weren't true, but you hear terrible stories about polar bears feeding their babies and their milk has PCBs up in the nowheres, you know? So, and even in clean parts of Puget Sound, there are PCBs in the sediment and there are PCBs in the food that people harvest for seafood. Lower, much lower levels. So all that to say that we do need to, and the cleanup plan allows us to look over time at the reductions in the concentration through not active, but after active cleanup, the natural processes. And when we feel like we've done everything we could and it's not getting any cleaner, I think that's where we end. And then the cleanup plan allows us to either take additional action that might take a different cleanup plan, or acknowledge that we have hit the limits of what we can do.
Right. And I think this is a real important thing for the community to understand. When you say end, you're talking about EPA's actions.
Right.
But with us in the community and the Department of Ecology, this is an ongoing process. When EPA says you're done, doesn't mean we're done. That we still probably are going to have to do work on controlling sources in the watershed, and everything else. So that work will continue to happen. But you'll also keep monitoring the site, right?
Yes, that is exactly right. We have a long-term monitoring program, and that will continue. And we also, one other thing that will likely continue is the work that we started after the cleanup plan, which is to work with the community members who are fishers, right? Or who eat a lot of fish. And that's a program that I'm not managing, so I always forget to mention it, but my friend and coworker Piper leads a program with working with the Department of Health, and they have identified community leaders basically in the Khmer community, the Latino community, Latinx community, the Vietnamese community, and these community members now understand Superfund as well as I do, and they can go out into their communities with messaging that is culturally relevant and with great ideas. They are called community health advocates, and I think this program is really going to help people make the right choice about, sure, you can fish, but don't eat the fish, if it's a resident fish. So lots of nuances in the messaging, but culturally relevant nuances. So
right. So, but the important fact, not only in the fisher groups and the community health advocates that we have,
yeah,
but also with the work that EPA does, you're not going away. You'll come back and test this site. How often?
Well, thank you for setting me up, because there's something we call a 5-year review. So if we have a site that still has contamination above the levels that we consider safe for unrestricted use, we always have to go back every 5 years and check and say, are we still doing the best we can do here to protect the environment and human health? So that's what we do every 5 years. Is the remedy, is the cleanup plan, right? Is that work done and did it accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish? So yes, there is a process, and we will be around, and hopefully, you know, EPA will be here, but I will be retired.
And so will I. Probably Bill too. Yes,
Bill
absolutely.
signaling.
Maggie might still be around. She's
Go
just
Maggie.
Yeah. But just before we end this, what I wanted to make sure that people understood, and maybe to hear it from you, is that it is an ongoing process, yes. But it is a very specific process that we're going through. So right now, we're getting closer on the upper third of the river, as you said, from Tukwila. Then there's the middle one that we've just started. And we're doing a lot of testing in that. And so kind of explain how we're figuring out, you know, what we need to do in the upper and the middle and eventually the lower.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that the cleanup plan has these numbers, the remedial action levels, those numbers that say, where do you have to do something? So we find we go out in a boat, we take a sample of the mud, take it to a laboratory, they analyze it to find out how much PCBs is in this mud. And then they compare the PCBs that are there to the PCBs that trigger action, right? So if they're above that action trigger, then they have to draw a line that includes that sediment and take cleanup action there. And the cleanup plan says, you know, up to a certain point, your cleanup action might be a thin layer, this enhanced natural recovery. But if it's above that number, you have to do something more serious. You have to dredge it, or you have to cap it with a thick cap. So that is in doing the design, we first refine the boundaries where action is needed. And the ROD, the cleanup plan, is based on, you know, a lot of data, but still not enough data to draw the perfect line, right? So we have done additional samples to get that line to be just right. We don't want to clean up stuff that doesn't need cleanup. We do want to clean up what does need cleanup, right? We want to make sure we're doing the right thing. So that is a kind of a 2-year process to refine the edges. And then when they have the areas defined, then they do engineering drawings and contracting drawings and requirements for contractors, because that's how it works. They, and I say they because it isn't EPA, it's people who agree to do the work under EPA's authority. So those people, they hire contractors. Oh, Bill wants to weigh in here, but they hire contractors to do the construction work. And we have to be able to tell the contractors exactly what we want them to do. And we also have to have plans to show that they're doing it, and plans to show that it's not hurting the water quality, and plans for what they do with the stuff that they dig out. So there's a lot of planning. And that's what we're doing for the second part. The first part is defining those boundaries exactly. And the second part is getting the detailed plans and engineering drawings. So Bill, did you want to throw yourself in there?
No, I was emphasizing, I was saying, that's great. I'm so glad you hit that, because I was gonna mention that sort of the polluter pays principle of Superfund,
Right.
which is super important. So I'll just expand on it just a little bit here, because I think it's critical. Because people say, oh well, you know, the polluters are the ones who are doing all these studies and all this work. And I think it's important that the principle of a Superfund cleanup is that the polluter is going to pay. And if the polluter can't pay, then the US government is going to do it. And then, you know, we'll hand a bill to the polluter for a really big amount. So it compels the polluter to do what EPA says. And so it's experts like Elly who tell the polluters what they're going to do. This is what the law says you're required to do. Do this. Elly reviews their work, make sure it's the right work, so it's a team effort. But it's the federal government making sure that the polluter is paying and that the public is being protected. And it's a powerful law. Superfund is a very powerful law, and compels some really important work A lot of it's already been done in the Lower Duwamish, so it's pretty neat. While I have the floor, I want to do something, James, because I think it's important. I know that DRCC is great at this, but I wouldn't be a good public affairs person if I didn't say this. All of the information that Ellie has talked about is a lot of it's technical. Ellie does a spectacular job, as you know, of sort of making this really approachable and understandable. But all of these documents that we've talked about, this remedial investigation / feasibility study that you held up, James, and this record of decision, these are all long names for relatively simple concepts, right? The remedial investigation feasibility study, I always say it's sort of the initial study that says, hey, what needs to be cleaned up? What's risky to people? What needs to be cleaned up? Where is it? And then what are the best ways? Probably a multitude of ways what are the best ways we think to clean it up? That's what the remedial investigation feasibility study does. That's available on EPA's website. People can look at it. And then this record of decision it's a crazy name, record decision, ROD. It's just the cleanup plan. It's the final, this is what we think is the plan. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. We looked at all these options in this remedial investigation feasibility study. This is what we're going to do. And it's not like it's the final word etched in stone. It is, EPA continues to take information, what's going on, what's working, what's not working, and things can change over time within that cleanup decision. And
like a good roadmap.
It's a super good road, right? Exactly. So the most important thing people can know, and again, James, you guys do a great job of this, is if people are curious about it, about what we're doing, what was done, how we base these decisions and this work, they can go to our EPA's website. All of this stuff is there. It's complex, but it's all there, and we are happy to help people understand it better.
And if I may add, we have lots of meetings. This is a site where we do meetings. And we have stakeholder meetings that are open to anyone who's interested, and a listserv. And so if you're interested in getting information, we can add your name to the listserv and you'll get periodic updates. We have a round table for the design process. So as I'm going through the upper reach and the middle reach, those two sections, I'm talking to the roundtable members, but anybody can be in the room listening and asking questions as the moment arises. But we're trying to get, we recognize that this is a community that has borne a disproportionate burden of the pollution associated with our excellent industrial. Really, the Dewamish has suffered greatly as a river, but it's created this economic machine. So it's an interesting balance. And we know that these two communities were there first, and then industry came and kind of surrounded them. So we understand that it's, we need to bring the community along with us, or go with the community up to a point, right? We have our clear requirements, but we really want to make sure you understand and help us to minimize the impacts on the community.
So in trying to wrap this all up, and again, thank you both very much for having the opportunity for us to understand. We've heard about the industries, the responsible parties who have to pay for this. The polluter pays, as Bill said, and how they work with EPA. But I'd like to hear from you, Elly. How about the community voice? That community voice is, how important is that to you?
Well, it is really important to EPA to hear the community voice, but there is a cleanup plan. There is a plan. And so we're trying to do the work in the plan. And so we can hear the community voice about what they would prefer. Like when I think about construction in the vicinity of a neighborhood, right? I think people are going to have concerns. They're going to say, that's going to make a lot of noise, or there's going to be traffic, and it's going to affect my ability to get to work on time or to take my kid to school. Or I'm concerned about being able to walk on the beach, or I need to get my kayak in the water. So there's lots of community needs and desires. And to some extent, if we know about those, we might be able to work around them and minimize the effect on the community. And that's a key for this community, and for my listening to hear whether there are ways we can make it work better for the community. And if this roundtable works as we hope it will, there are conversations that can happen between government and community members and businesses, so that if I can't make something happen as an EPA person, maybe somebody else can make something happen. It's not just about what can EPA do. And I have been remiss. I haven't really mentioned our partners at Department of Ecology, the State Department of Ecology. They're kind of like an EPA for Washington. And they have been also partners in this, and they work with the community as well. They are, we kind of divided roles. Backing up a little bit, we divided roles. They are looking at controlling pollution sources to the river, and we are doing the river cleanup. So
I wanted to make sure that everybody understands that we've talked about early action areas. We've talked about the remedial investigation feasibility study, or what's there and how could it be cleaned up. And then the proposed cleanup plan, and then the record of decision. The community has been involved in every one of those levels.
right,
So when you say, we already have a record of decision, so that's what we want to do. Well, the community has already had input into that record of decision.
yeah,
And from the proposed plan, it was actually strengthened to the record of decision. And that's a lot of that was because of what the community had said, that they want the best cleanup that they can get.
It's a super good point, James, because it's a critical part of that process, right? When we put out a proposed plan, we're proposing it to the community, right? And so then we have a public comment period, and we hold meetings and exchange ideas. And you're exactly right. The cleanup, the final cleanup plan for the Lower Duwamish changed between the proposed plan and the final plan. And the community had a great deal to do with those changes. So you're precisely right. I'm really glad that you emphasized that. That's a critical piece of the work that we all do together.
And so my email is james@drcc.org. So if anybody has a question, they can let me know. I can forward those questions on to Ellie or Bill, or to whoever else they need to go, like Piper we talked about a little bit. But again, I feel real good about having you here, because I know how much work you do and how much you care about what's going on. And so thank you both very, very much for having the opportunity. And hopefully we're not going to be as nervous the next time as we try to figure out the technology and everything else, which we learned a valuable lesson today ourselves. So I'm going to turn this back over to Maggie. And oh no, please go ahead.
I want to say one thing. The meetings I mentioned used to all be just in English, but we have Spanish, Vietnamese, and Cambodian interpreters now. And this is to be, everybody's welcome.
Exactly. So thank you both again. Okay, Maggie.
All
Thank you, James.
right.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you all for that. Oh, it sounds like technology nowadays. All right. Thank you all for this amazing info. James, thank you for taking over the facilitation. I mean, I'm excited to get questions. So if anyone that sees this video in our website and social media, and you have any questions for Ellie, for Bill, for James, for myself, I will list our emails on the top of this video. So if you have any questions, please reach out. Is there any other way to reach out to any of you that you prefer?
You can use my email address.
Email?
And that is, hale.elly@epa.gov.
Awesome. Thank you. And then the rest I'll just post. That way people could copy those down. But other than that, gracias. Thank you so much.
Well, nada.
Thank you all. That was
Gracias.
great. Thanks so much for doing this and asking us to participate.
Yeah.
This is good.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye-bye.
all.
Adios.